Hello and welcome to the Transfers podcast, powered by FootballTransfers.com, a new podcast where we bring you news, insight and analysis on that most important of the least important things, football. I'm Duncan Castles and I'm joined this week by French football's man of parts, musician, philosopher, biographer of Eric Cantona and Thierry Henry, journalist for a legion of publications including Eurosport and the must-read investigative magazine Josimar, a man who manages to highlight the beauty and the baseness of our sport with equal aplomb. Welcome to the Transfers podcast, Philippe Auclair.
Thank you very much, Duncan. I don't know what to say. I think that's it. I can go out now and walk out in the sunset, happy with my contribution, before I ruin everything by showing my ignorance.
I know that won't happen. Thank you for
Fingers
joining
crossed.
us. We're going to talk about various subjects today, including one of your special areas, one of the areas where you've produced a huge amount of information for readers on the world of football down the years, which is FIFA and the governance of football. I mentioned beauty and baseness of sport with equal aplomb there. I was reading one of your articles yesterday where you talked about the various governing bodies, the confederations of football, and FIFA's failure to run competitive elections for their presidential positions for over 7 years now, which you signed off with the line, if football wants to be a family, it's not obliged to take The Sopranos as its model, which I loved and which we will get into later. But let's start talking about a player who could consider himself quite unlucky not to have found himself in Sunday's European Championship final, which is going to be between Spain and England now. We'll also talk about that later in the podcast. And that's Xavi Simons, who scored the first goal in the game in the semi-final against England, a quite spectacular goal in his competition with Yamin Lamal to bring delight to semi-finals and football fans everywhere. He is the subject of pursuit by Bayern Munich. 21-year-old at Paris Saint-Germain. He was signed from Barcelona in 2021 as a free agent, a deal done by the football director at PSG at the time, Leonardo. Subsequently sold to PSV Eindhoven a year later with a 6 million buyback clause and an exceptional season in the Eredivisie where he scored 19 in 34 games, the equal highest scorer in the league. Then bought back from PSV by Paris Saint-Germain and immediately loaned to Leipzig, where he again performed above expectations, scoring 10 and 40 in the Bundesliga, and has been identified by Bayern Munich as one of the talents they'd like to bring in to turn around what was one of the worst seasons in a couple of decades, basically, for them. This is a fascinating situation because PSG ideally would like to keep the player. They'd like to reintegrate him into their squad. He's in many ways the perfect fit for what they've done over the last year, which is overhaul, get rid of all the highly paid, expensive stars, older players, move towards a model of young talents, idea of signing the best young players in the world and building a squad that can win the Champions League off the back of it. He, however, controls the situation because of a clause that was inserted in his contract when they signed him from Barcelona. He can choose if he wants to stay at Leipzig. He will also have to move to Bayern only if they meet PSG's asking price for the player, which will be 100 million euros. That's what they value him as. But PSG cannot force him to come back because of the way the contract's structured. So they have to persuade him to come back, sell him to the suitors at the asking price, which Bayern obviously don't want to pay that amount of money, or potentially have him stay for another season on loan at Leipzig. There is interest from England, but there have been no offers as yet. But we know the way English clubs act, and maybe last night's performance will change that. What, Philippe, do you think about the overhaul of PSG, the state of the club at present after last season, and where they go without Kylian Mbappe, and how they solve problems like this, having really good players on their books in principle, but not actually being able to control specifically where he goes to?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit the story of PSG. I think we could create probably a team, Duncan, of a really good team, European level, by putting together all the young players which PSG has found a way to lose over the years. It's quite remarkable. It has to be said that on the field, Luis Enrique has more or less succeeded in the job that he was given. Okay, he hasn't won the Champions League. Okay, fine. But he has managed to turn that really difficult corner, which came after Neymar's departure, the whole failed Messi project. This absolutely is managed to keep the club going during what was basically almost open warfare between the Mbappe camp and Nasser Al-Khelaifi. So you would say, yeah, they're doing the right thing. You're seeing players like Barcola coming in and doing extremely well, and you're thinking actually Xavi Simons is exactly the type of player that they want.
Yeah.
And exactly because he has also something that Luis Enrique absolutely loves, which is versatility. He can play, you look at where he's played in the past, he's played left, he's played right, he's played centre forward, he's played attacking mid, he's played central midfield, he's played in every single position. He's very young. I have to say, and that's my confession, I didn't know about this clause, Duncan, until you told me about it. And I am really struggling to remember another player being in a situation like this one, where basically that player and his agent, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's our friend Darren Dean, isn't it? Are in a position to dictate a club where it's the anti-bossman. It's very opposite. You take everything, you put it on its head, and that's what happens. And it would be absolutely perfect for the kind of project that PSG is trying to do at the moment. The idea is that the direction of the club, which was Nasser Al-Khelaifi, even Al-Khelaifi is saying that he's now out of the picture in terms of running the club day to day, to be taken with a pinch of salt, of course, is to actually give more freedom and more leeway to their manager after years of preventing genuine managers like Pochettino or Carlo Ancelotti to work properly like managers. They take somebody whom they think more of a coach, and they're actually giving him the power in shaping the team, that is, only in shaping the team, that they had previously prevented those other managers to do. This is very strange. But I have to say that seen from a purely sporting point of view, it does make sense. And you have seen that some of their recruitment has actually been quite good. I think many people will not have been aware because they were completely obsessed, focused on the PSG of the superstars. That Vitinha, for example, has been an absolutely key recruit. And I think people maybe after this Euro will realize what an absolutely fantastic player he is. And there are others, but there are also question marks about other players, because what's happening to Ugarte, for example, and also what's happening to the commercial project. Because when I walk on Oxford Street in London, I don't know if you've seen that, but on Oxford Street in London, between all these very strange shops which sell American candy and souvenirs for tourists and the big department stores, there is a football shop. And this football shop is a Paris Saint-Germain shop, which is crazy. They have a huge shop on Oxford Street, the biggest high street in London. And I was walking past it yesterday, and I could still see Kylian Mbappe's face on some of the advertisements. And I'm thinking, okay, you're going to have to take that off, and pretty pronto, guys. And what are you going to put in their place? Are you going to put Dembele? Are you going to put... What are you going to do exactly? So that's where I think one of the big problems they have. I don't think the problem they have would be necessarily on the pitch in France. It won't be. The team, actually, you look at the squad, is very solid. The manager, yes, has done an excellent job. It has to be said, in very difficult circumstances. But they've got to completely realign themselves commercially, as well as like they have done and are doing in football terms. And you would have thought, actually, that having a player like Xavi Simons, who is now, that's it, he's arrived on the big stage. We've known about him for years because he hasn't been exactly discreet in his achievements. And also people should remember he was the player that Thierry Henry, for example, almost anointed as his successor, his heir. We might have to do something with the connection with Darren Dean here, but he did it. And you think if they're losing that player, could be really one of the key foundation stones of the new PSG, that's not good. And also, I'm wondering what the rest of the football world will say if they think, have you seen that contract that PSG has given Simons? What's wrong with those guys? It's not good for the reputation, is it?
As always, Philippe, you touch on all the pertinent points. Yeah, I've never heard about a contract like that previously. I think it sets a very difficult precedent in a time in which player individual power is growing hugely at clubs and causing a problem for clubs, and I think causing a problem for the structure of football. I think in terms of the way he plays, you identify he is, yes, a very good fit to what they do in terms both of the way he plays and in his status. And I think on top of that creativity, he's a very good tackler. He's got a combination of elements that are, I'm not going to say unique, but rare in modern football.
Yeah, I was going to say, Duncan, he's part of this new generation of players who tend to be all-rounders and good at everything they do.
Yeah, like Vitinha, for example.
Exactly.
And also, to a certain extent, João Neves. We discussed on a recent podcast that Luis Enrique, again, you identified that Luis Enrique is a major say in the structuring of this team, which is new for PSG. Enrique loves Vitinha because he has a flexibility to play in different ways and different positions in the midfield. I know there are people at the very top end of the Premier League who also love Vitinha for that range of abilities. And yes, PSG are looking at João Neves because João Neves has some of that skill set and that ability to play in different positions and do creative things and destructive things in one package. Yes, also the commercial side. You highlight what's going on in the commercial side, and I can tell you that my information is there is a tension within PSG at present in that the huge commercial department that they have, huge commercial department that was built up off the back of signing players like Lionel Messi, Mbappe, Neymar, are asking for big stars. So they, I'm told, are rebelling to a certain extent against this process of focusing primarily on young talents, focusing on the team rather than the individual, because it's hurting that commercial bottom line, which you provide a great concrete example of, the still having Kylian Mbappe's picture front and centre in their London commercial outlet. They want that solved. You also mentioned Ugarte. Let's just talk about his situation, because this again underlines where PSG are operating at present. Ugarte signed from Sporting for €60 million release clause last summer. There are people at PSG who think he had a very good first season. There are other people.
He had a very good first few months of the season. He was absolutely fantastic in the autumn of 2023.
Yeah.
And then things it didn't quite happen at the same level. He was not a catastrophe, far from it, but he actually wasn't. And when you saw him in the first few months, you thought, wow, this guy is going to be there, play 90 minutes every week. He's going to play all the big games. And in fact, he did not.
And he's excellent at winning and retaining possession, not as good in the more creative, the more subtle elements of midfield play. And I think that is the reason why his season tailed off, because Enrique was not completely happy with the way he played, and Enrique would be happy to sell him this summer. In fact, is pushing, I'm told, for a sale and the money to be reinvested in a replacement midfielder. He has been offered to Manchester United. Manchester United have had discussions about taking him from PSG. The position of PSG, that there's been some reporting that Manchester United have offered players in exchange. The position of PSG is, if you want the player, you must pay back the money we spent last season. This is not us clearing the decks because we think we've made a mistake. We'd like to retain him. However, if you buy us out of our position, then we're prepared to allow him to go, because the coach is open to that change.
Mm-hmm.
Whether Manchester United will be able to do that or not is an open question. They are very active in the market at present. They're advanced on doing a deal for Joshua Zirkzee. player who had been on his way to Milan, but the deal fell through because Milan refused to pay his agent Kia Joorabchian's €15 million commission. You can take from Manchester United's state of advancement in that deal that they are prepared to satisfy the agent's terms. They've agreed personal terms. They are also working on deals for Mattjhijs de Ligt at present, who is for sale from Bayern. It is a huge overhaul at Manchester United. We have a new chief executive coming in from Manchester City, Omar Barada, with Dan Ashworth. Finally managed to come from Newcastle United when Manchester United took advantage of Newcastle United's profit and sustainability regulation issues to negotiate an acceptable fee for his services. We have Jason Wilcox in. We have an unexpected arrival of Christophe Vivel as for the time being, temporary director of global talent. Individual who used to be at Leipzig and then moved to Chelsea, was very unhappy with his situation at Chelsea and has just finished a period of 12 months gardening leave, allowing him to work for United. Philippe, you've been watching English football and reporting on English football in depth for many years now. What is your impression of this new revolutionary Manchester United that Jim Ratcliffe and Ineos have set in motion?
I must confess I retain quite a lot of skepticism towards what is going on at the moment. It's supposed to be, yes, the revolution, the reboot, Manchester United 2.0, all these sort of things.
It would be 3.0, I presume, because we had the cultural reboot, so this must be the reboot of the reboot.
The reboot of the reboot, yes, perhaps that. But at the same time, the first big decision they had to make was to keep on the coach that everybody thought they would dispense with, which already I thought that's a bit strange. That's a bit strange. And the situation has evolved since then in a way that doesn't make me think necessarily that there is a much clearer plan. I think many people who are fans of Manchester United, when they hear that two of the main targets or players on the way to Manchester United are Dutch, again, I think I can hear their sighs from where I am right now, thinking, what is going on here? And it would actually, by the way, tend to suggest that from a position of being the man who was in the antechamber to the execution room, Erik ten Hag is now the one who is calling the shots, and which is rather surprising because that's not exactly what you would have expected if you have a whole new structure being put in place. This being said, to be absolutely fair to the new regime, you cannot operate a change of that magnitude like this in a matter of weeks or months. It takes time, and they will need time anyway. But the first signs, I don't know. I don't find anything in there which makes me excited, Duncan. Maybe we shouldn't get excited about things, but sometimes nice. Sometimes you think, oh, actually, we're going somewhere. And the fact is, and I want to touch on that, I think that they have been able to operate at the moment, Manchester United, in a relatively turbulence-free zone in terms of the media.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's going to last. There's already been a little bit of pushback with the announcement of the 250 redundancies at the club, which are going to enable the club to basically save the equivalent of Mason Mount's salary, if that. So that hasn't gone down well. The way they've treated the women's team hasn't gone down well with some of their support. I think a lot of their support don't really care one way or another, if I'm absolutely honest. But these are things that maybe if they imagine for 1 second, if these were the first decisions taken by a foreign owner, imagine somebody coming from the Middle East or from America and arriving in a club, and first thing he does almost is sack a quarter or a fifth of a quarter of the workforce. I think there would be a lot of pushback for that. Imagine if that same owner decided, you know what, our women's team really not worth spending money on. And imagine what the impact would be. That the media impact would be quite significant. And so far,
Or if a foreign owner came in and one of his first public announcements was, we would like Old Trafford to be rebuilt and we would like the government to fund the rebuild of Old Trafford.
Absolutely, and which was totally to be expected. And also, I have to say, I was totally amazed, maybe I shouldn't be, when I read about the cost of the takeover. And you think, hold on, they first spent about £9.6 million on getting the deal done with Ratcliffe. And since then, and this is rock solid information, the total amount of money which has been spent to make the agreement happen, Manchester United's money, let's be clear about that, is £40 million. That is an insane sum. I'm sorry, it is insane. And again, and Duncan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I've never heard about a takeover costing as much money as this one. Ever. And when you talk about that, this is obviously the legal fees and all consultancy fees charged by one camp and the other camp and perhaps a third, I don't know. But £40 million, that is colossal. That's a new player. Have you ever heard of anything like this happen?
I don't know what the total cost of the Chelsea takeover was. I know there were very substantial payments made to certain individuals working within Chelsea as part of the agreement, which would get in that direction. But yes, it is. I agree. It's a very substantial amount of money.
And Chelsea, it's also trying to find a new owner for a club which has basically been repossessed by the nation because of the sanctions against Russia. And it's a rather different and
it was a far more complicated transaction.
Exactly,
that is true.
Absolutely.
Let's note the same company doing the work and charging the fees on the transaction.
Now that's interesting. And a note has been made, Duncan. But anyway, we were talking about the Ratcliffe regime, and just to sum up, I think, yes, he's had a very easy game of it so far. And because he's British, because he's said to be a Manchester United supporter, because it means that the Glazers no longer have control over that side of the club. So for all these reasons, suddenly he's got a free hand, and some of the interviews with him have been so fawning. It was actually quite embarrassing at times. No hard questions being asked. And also, it's not the only thing, excuse me, but we've got to think about Manchester United's realignment in terms of its relationship with the Premier League, which is also very important because it's quite aggressive what's been happening so far. We've got to think about what he said about Todibo, the situation with Todibo and OGC Nice and the rest of the Ineos group, and the fact that I can tell you that my friends in France, they're a bit worried about what's going to happen. They're very worried about what's going to happen. And it's going to be, and you get the feeling as well from Ratcliffe, is that he's not somebody who likes to be confronted directly. I think he doesn't suffer fools gladly. I wouldn't expect a multi-billionaire to be any different from that. But he seems to be quite set in his ways, and also not to take no for an answer, and to be quite touchy about the line of questioning that he's subjected to, because he's not used to that. I think we should credit Ratcliffe with speaking publicly, with opening himself up to interviews. You're absolutely right.
And that's something we don't often have from most owners of football clubs, certainly owners of football clubs of this status, and absolutely didn't have with the previous owners. So we should credit him with that. Let's talk about Ten Hag's situation, because you mentioned that at the start of this section. It is fascinating because, as you say, it looked like he was gone. There was no secret that Manchester United, the Ineos group, Dave Brailsford at its helm, in terms of being on the ground at Old Trafford and Carrington, were reviewing every aspect of the way the club run. And a key aspect was the coach and the manager. We know they interviewed, or we've talked about in this podcast in the past, they brought in this kind of process of managerial speed dating around Dave Brailsford's 60th birthday party, where they invited Gareth Southgate, Maurizio Pochettino and Graham Potter to the party and gave themselves the opportunity to informally speak to three of the potential candidates to replace Ten Hag. in a situation where, or it's certainly something that I've never heard of before, and I think quite a clever move. Ultimately, however, Ten Hag won the FA Cup against expectations. There was a swell of support from the fan base, with reports ahead of that game that he was going to be sacked regardless of the outcome of the final. A replica of what happened to Louis van Gaal a few years previously. And the review process ended up with Ten Hag remaining in position, Ten Hag changing two of his coaches, which I was told was part of a mutual agreement to refresh his coaching staff, but having the choice of those coaches. So he's brought in Rennie Hake of Go Ahead Eagles, someone he worked with at FC20 and someone who has a huge reputation in Dutch football for the quality of his coaching, having qualified this past season. Go Ahead Eagles for Europe for the first time. And then Ruud van Nistelrooy also coming in, who has a clear and obvious status with Manchester United supporters because of his history of the club, but two Dutch coaches, which Ten Hag very much selected. A new goalkeeping coach, Jelle ten Rouwelaar, coming in from Burnley. Interestingly, in those discussions, he wasn't given a new contract, and there was a point where it was suggested that Manchester United would try and put a revised contract in place. They retained the original contract, which had an exercised 1-year option. That meant that Ten Hag retains his title of manager. It wasn't changed to head coach, which is something that could have happened if someone else had come in. And while the financial terms will not improve, I understand there is a stepped pay rise involved in that additional year. But key in this is he retains his veto over transfers. And as you've identified, looking at two Dutch players, one of whom he operated with before at Ajax, and he has a history of bringing players he has worked with before into the club. You get the sense that Ten Hag has taken a situation of great jeopardy and flipped it into one where he now has a great deal of control and a great deal of status at the club because Manchester United have decided to keep him and decided to extend the contract, decided to reshape the coaching staff, changes to the medical staff, which is something that Ten Hag had been asking for some time, and allowing him to take a clear role in transfers, at very least being able to say, I don't want that player, I'm not having that player. Whoever the recruitment department decide should come in to the team. And then a focus at present on players that are clearly ones he wants in a situation where the budget is limited.
Yeah, that's an awful lot. The budget is limited and the wage bill remains colossal. I don't know, to be honest, how much they can shave off that. We've heard that Ratcliffe has actually made a lot of noises about the fact that basically the clubs like Manchester United had their hands tied behind their back because of the new profit and sustainability rules which have been put in place by the Premier League. And in a way, all of this, the planets are aligned for Ten Hag to turn to them and to say, look at me, I won a very important game against a very big team. Let's not forget that. The FA Cup was not won against Wigan Athletic. And guys, what do you want? Do you want to wreck everything I've been doing? And this, I would actually be fascinated to know what this review process was. But the end result is that Erik ten Hag has stayed. And next time things are a little bit ropey for him, I think people will remember what happened this year. And that it will again strengthen his position. People will think, come on guys, you can't be serious. You could have sacked this guy 12 months ago and now you're going to do it. What the hell is wrong with you? Why did you keep him on then? A bit like, and you find yourself with, it had better work, let's put it that way.
I think one thing that's interesting for me is they seem to have ignored another option, which would have been simply to retain the status quo as was without extending the contract.
Yeah.
They had 1 year left in the contract. They could have kept Ten Hag in place, or called his bluff on whether he wanted to walk out because he was unhappy with the lack of support, which I think you see from what he was saying in the Netherlands, and you can find out from what he's been saying to people close to him, that he was understandably unhappy with the failure to support him, failure to back him for a sustained period. And there was the potential that he would just say, no, thank you very much. I don't want to work under these conditions. I leave. You find a replacement. But there was no need for Manchester United. I think this is PR driven, in my opinion. There's no need for them to give him the new contract. And the repercussions of what they're done, I think, are fascinating, because we've been talking about what Ratcliffe has said in public. But one, I think, absolutely consistent theme in all his interviews has been, we needed to change this from the top down, the operating of the club. We needed to bring in best-in-class people as chief executive, as sports director, as technical director. That is our way to redemption. The club hasn't been organised from a football perspective and from a structural perspective in the right way. We need better practitioners in these key roles, and they've gone and hired the people they thought were best in class and been very aggressive about that. But when it comes to the key person running the football side, I think it's very hard for them to argue, and I don't think they have had the braveness to say in their statements that we have placed best in class in charge of the football team. They've said, after our review process, we decided he was the best option, but that's very different from saying best in class. And on top of that, because of the way we've done it, as we've just discussed, they've handed him a degree of control over one of the fundamental aspects of the football department, which is this: everyone agrees the squad has to transition. Everyone agrees that they have, and this is, again, you can look at Ratcliffe's own words in this, that they've overspent. I think he talks about more than £1 billion of spending on transfer fees. He goes into quite significant detail on how they've wasted money on transfers, wasted money on salaries, and that has to change in order to revitalise the club. And I think he's absolutely correct on that. However, they've now given a very significant degree of control, the veto power over transfers, to someone who they were considering dismissing a few months ago.
Yes, in a nutshell, that you've defined why I use the word skepticism, I think, to start with, by which I don't mean that Erik ten Hag is a bad manager or a bad coach and he can't do better than what he has done, which, by the way, is not ridiculous at all when you think about it.
Yeah.
And you could imagine, you could say that being rid of what was a toxic environment, which certainly didn't help him do his job properly, and despite the environment he had found himself in, they'd managed to win trophies and to bring Manchester United in the Champions League. So that's a pretty good, I have to say, result when you consider what's been happening. When I hear Zirkzee and de Ligt are targets of Manchester United, I think, come on, these are Ten Hag signings. They are. It's obvious what is going on here exactly. But good luck to him. And I have to say, he played his cards absolutely superbly. He used a complicated transitional situation to his advantage, and he played his cards extremely well. And he's been rewarded with that, with this contract and staying at Manchester United. And in fact, being much freer to do his job now than he was before. Yes. The revolution, which was supposed to change everything at Manchester United. It's quite extraordinary.
Yes, I think, Philippe, you make a very good point. My comments about them handing control over to Ten Hag, I should add that Ten Hag was very unhappy with the way he had to operate at Manchester United. There were many things he wanted changed under the Glazers, which he was frustrated at being unable to change. It could be the case that giving him this degree of control in a new structure, and he's talked about how optimistic he is about working with the new football department team, Jason Wilcox and Dan Ashworth and Dave Brailsford, that give him the correct backing in a healthier environment, and he will take them where the club want to go. It's fascinating that Ineos have effectively heeded power at a key moment, because as you say, he and the people around him seem to have played their cards very well in this complex poker situation that they've been placed in. Philippe, let's move on to FIFA. I refer any of our listeners who don't follow Philippe on Twitter to his excellent social media account at Philippe Auclair, where he has a wonderful profile picture of himself, which is a cartoon from The Guardian, of Philippe sticking pins into a Gianni Infantino doll.
Thank you, David Squires. I really appreciate the fact that you let me use it as my profile picture.
So, Philippe, you have been instrumental in exposing how the World Cup ended up at Qatar and all the ramifications that had for FIFA, the end of the old era and the start of the Gianni Infantino era. It was supposed to be a great cleansing. It was supposed to be the new dawn for football. How do we end up into this new reign of Gianni Infantino? How do we end up with a 2030 World Cup of 48 nations to be played across 3 continents and 6 nations, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, Spain, Portugal and Morocco, without a vote on where that World Cup would be hosted? The 2034 World Cup in Saudi Arabia, without a vote on where that World Cup would be hosted. Gianni Infantino himself re-elected twice, unopposed, after sidestepping term limits he himself introduced on FIFA presidencies, refusing to hold a press conference after FIFA Congress. We have a 32-team FIFA Club World Cup to look forward to, in inverted commas, in the United States next summer, starting on June 15th, to allow FIFA to retain its international break at the beginning of June, which means that players will not get their mandatory 4 weeks rest before the domestic season. We have them proposing I think a 48-team Women's World Cup. And on that Club World Cup, they have retained the existing annual 6-team Club World Cup to be renamed the Intercontinental Cup, because we just don't have enough international fixtures. How exactly have we got ourselves, and I haven't talked about rewrites of the law or video-assisted referees or proposals for biannual World Cups, how exactly have we got ourselves into this position with the lead governance of the most popular sport, most popular pastime in the world?
First of all, I must congratulate you, Duncan, on this magnificent shopping list that you have put together, because I think we could find a few more things to it, but it's already it's a pretty impressive resume of what has happened since 2016, when it was supposed to be FIFA 2.0, and because you could also add the fact that the end of independent ethics committees, the end, the colonization of the African Football Confederation. There is so much to add. Basically, what we are now, what we see in football is what we also see in society and politics in the world at large, which is basically it's been a process towards autocracy. And this is how the process towards autocracy functions. Is that the checks and balances are taken away. One of the first things which should have made us, certainly did to me, but everybody stand to attention, is that traditionally the role of the FIFA president, and I know this will surprise some people when they hear that, was distinct. A lot of his responsibilities and duties, what we think now as responsibilities and duties, were the responsibilities and duties of the Secretary General, who was like a first Prime Minister. And then the FIFA Executive Committee was the Council of Ministers. So Sepp Blatter, for example, never wielded the power of an autocrat, despite what people think, despite the constant re-elections in sometimes a bit dubious circumstances. He was not somebody who could just walk into his room and decide, this is going to be what I'm going to do, and this is what FIFA is going to do, and that's it. It was impossible for him. The Confederation had a degree of autonomy, sometimes a great degree of autonomy in certain respects. The African Confederation, we decided to certainly had it. And so did UEFA.
With, just to interject, with a principal example being that Blatter did not want the World Cup to go to Qatar.
Absolutely. And he did everything he could, including getting Michael Garcia, at least for a while, on to investigate the vote in favor of Qatar, and if at all possible, to have it annulled. And this didn't happen. And I think, yes, you're absolutely right. This is one of many instances in which he didn't have his own way. He had it in some others, but not in this one, which was perhaps the most significant. Now, the thing is now, whatever Gianni does, and whatever Gianni wants, rather, Gianni gets. And it has been an incremental process, because to start with, for example, he paid lip service to some of the things he had talked about in his program and during the election, where it should be remembered it was a contested election because there was also Sheikh Salman and there was also Georges Champagne at the time. So there were 3 candidates. These were the good old days. And for example, to start with, he put in place quite a strong governance and ethics committee. And he brought in Miguel Maduro, who is a very well-known academic and lawyer from Portugal, who actually did some great work to try and clean up a few things in FIFA. But the minute Miguel Maduro overstepped the limits of his job, in Gianni's mind, that is when he actually prevented Vitaly Mutko, the Russian sports minister, ally of Vladimir Putin, to become a member of the FIFA Council, because there cannot be any relationship of that type between politics and football when you look at the statutes.
Mm-hmm.
That was one step too much, because obviously this was a snub directed at Russia before the 2018 World Cup, which was going there. So that was impossible. Maduro, his contract was not renewed. And then little by little, every single of the departments of FIFA, which had a modicum of independence in the way they were functioning, were brought in line. FIFA today is very much ruled as a one-man show. He's a dictator. He's a dictator. The dictator is somebody who, exactly what the origin, the etymology of the word suggests, somebody who dictates, somebody who orders.
Yeah.
And he has a retinue, a coterie of very close advisors, which have been with him for a very long time. Many of them he already knew from their time at UEFA. One of the most important is Matthias Grafström, who is now the Secretary General, who is a complete loyalist. And then you've got this galaxy, this constellation of Italian and Swiss advisor consultants who have been brought in almost every single department of FIFA, and who basically run everything. If you look at the business affairs of FIFA, they're now run by a guy called Romy Guy. Now, Romy Guy is a guy who has no past with FIFA whatsoever, has been in the world of football. He was at Juve for a while. He was an advisor as well to the Saudis for quite a long time. And Romy Guy is now basically the guy who takes the commercial decisions and business decisions for FIFA. FIFA now has, for example, a gambling sponsor. Totally unthinkable when it was SEP. But since 2022, they now have Betano, just like Betano is also with UEFA now. And all the decisions are basically being taken by Gianni and his circle of friends. They're then put to this very strange body called the FIFA Council. I promise you, have a look at who is in the FIFA Council. I guess and bet that half of the people there you've never heard of, and you never see them anywhere. They just turn up 3-4 times a year at these various meetings at which they drink champagne, if they drink alcohol, and they do what Gianni tells them to do. The bidding process is an absolute joke. The way you were talking about the 2030 and the 2034 World Cup, the way that the deal was cut, it's a very long story. I've written a lot about it, but so I would say if people want to go into the detail of it, just Google my name and Saudi Arabia. I think quite a few things will immediately pop up. But basically what happened is that a deal has to be done which would prevent clash of interests, and in which because the end result for Gianni has got to be two things. A, there's got to be more money for FIFA. B, it's got to be good for Gianni and enable him to stay in power and not have any opposition whatsoever. Now he's managed to change the statute so he can have an extra mandate. And believe me, he'll find a way to carry on like Vladimir Putin did He might have a Medvedev moment for 4 years and then come back. I don't know. But he will find a way. Don't worry about that. So a deal had to be cut. And for that, the Saudis had to be told they wanted to go for 2030, but Jenny had to explain to them, guys, you're great. You're giving me all this money, the Aramco money, the sponsorship that they wanted to have for the Women's World Cup, etc. The sponsorship of the club.
Of FIFA, the sponsorship of FIFA that they're
absolutely,
producing.
And the Club World Cup and all the money, and also the indirect sponsorship of the African Football Confederation, which is basically now a colony of FIFA. But he had to find a way so that it would please the Saudis, because the Saudis are bringing a lot of money, a lot of power, and they have their own project, which he really likes. And the Saudis bring a lot of votes, because the Saudis everywhere in the world have signed so-called memorandum of understanding with dozens and dozens of federations. And fairly obviously, the federations which have benefited from the Saudis' largesse are not going to go against the Saudis' wishes when it comes to choosing a new FIFA president. And the new FIFA president, as far as the Saudis are concerned, they want him to be in power as long as Mohammed bin Salman, which means forever. But on the other hand, what about CONMEBOL? CONMEBOL wanted that tournament, and it was the centenary. First World Cup, 1930, then 2030. And they had a very solid bid. And I have to say, if you're a football fan, the thought of having a World Cup in Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, my goodness, I'm going there. It's going to cost me a lot of money, but I'm going there. But no, so they had to make way because there was something more important to be done, which is to placate UEFA. And to placate UEFA, we had to go for the bid of Spain and Portugal, which conveniently enough also had an important Moroccan part to it, which also means, and Morocco is very powerful within CAF as well, so the African Football Confederation. So it was a means, okay, we're going to please UEFA and CAF by having the tournament in Europe and North Africa. We're going to give little crumbs to the South Americans by giving them a few games to kick off the tournament as a celebration of the centenary of the tournament. And because they're a bit desperate for it, they say, why not? We'll have it, and we're so happy, except the poor Chileans, who were left without anything. And then you tell the Saudis, look, we've done exactly what you wanted us to do. The road is now clear for 2034, because you know what we've done by doing what we've done? Okay, that's CAF, UEFA, and CONMEBOL out of the picture, because the principle
can't have two World Cups
exactly
in a
row. Rotation of continents and confederations, despite the fact that how many games will there be in 2030 in South America? Less than there are, or fewer than there are, fingers on one hand. But it meant that for 2034, suddenly, which were the confederations left? You had the Oceania Football Confederation, and good luck for organizing a World Cup in Tonga, Vanuatu, and so forth, and Fiji, and New Zealand, perhaps.
You had Australia versus Saudi Arabia, and Australia deciding that there was no point even engaging in an election, that they had zero chance of winning.
Absolutely none. We have to be precise and to say that Australia was part of an AFC, so Asian Football Confederation bid, together with Singapore and maybe Malaysia. That was the idea, is that there would be a rival bid. But what happened, because Australia has joined the Asian Confederation quite a while ago, but what happened is that, okay, so it's not going to be the Oceania, so it's got to be Asia. Okay, so who is the big daddy in the Asian Football Confederation? Who is there putting his hand up and saying, I want it? The Saudis, of course. And then you've got the Australians and Singapore and I believe Malaysia, who for a while very tentatively say we might be interested. But what happens is that there's an Asian Confederation assembly, a General Assembly, which is held in Kuala Lumpur. And amazingly enough, within 24 hours, Singapore and Malaysia have decided, you know what? Yeah, to have unity in football, we are not going to present our bid. The Australians found themselves on their own, and they knew they were going to lose. And without any discussion having happened, any vote having been taken, Saudi Arabia was placed as the sole candidate for the 2034 World Cup. FIFA, we could say, yeah, it's the Sopranos in terms of the familia, but in terms of the actual regime, it's an autocracy. And whoever walks past the line that has been drawn in the sand, good luck to you, you're out, my friend. And there's been, by the way, a huge turnover of personnel within FIFA. I don't know if you were aware of that, but they did away with their whole governance division. Amazing,
Yes.
isn't it? All 7 members were made free to find careers somewhere else. There are loads of cases which I really can't talk openly because I wouldn't want you to get into trouble, but of people who have done internal complaints, basically whistleblowers who find themselves within FIFA, who find themselves in really delicate situations because of it. So you carry on, and this is where we are. Football is basically in the hands of, a dictator. There's no other word for it. And you have to tell me how it's possible to get rid of it, because the people who could oust Gianni Infantino, if they wanted to at the next Congress, they could have a motion of no confidence. I'm sure the statutes would allow for something like that to happen. Are the 211 member associations, but the 211 member associations are doing very well. Enough of them anyway, are doing very well out of the largesse of FIFA in terms of money, the money that is going
out of the increased revenue that's being generated by all of these bloated or new tournaments that Infantino has introduced.
Yeah, the member associations, most of them anyway, quite happy with what's happening. They have got a greater chance to take part in major tournaments, because the tournaments are so bloated now that even very small nations have a chance not to qualify. Yeah, okay, fine. They get more money because of directly and indirectly. And they also get their games being shown on FIFA TV Plus and all these sort of things. So there's more revenue, more exposure, more chances of being present in tournaments. Why wouldn't you vote for Gianni Infantino, despite the fact that what he's doing is basically destroying football? And as an autocrat, it's the benevolent autocrat, if benevolent up to a point, but it's the generous autocrat who is making an awful lot of money himself out of it, but is at least sharing quite a large chunk of it. So the situation is completely blocked and locked. Any attempts from the ranks has been suppressed, basically. And there is no great deal of willingness from the confederations, which are not part of FIFA, but which should be a kind of counterpower, to actually confront FIFA head-on. UEFA at one point was ready to do that, but I think that there is now a kind of uneasy peace between the European Confederation and FIFA.
As you point out in your recent Eurosport article, this lack of democratic elections at the head of FIFA is replicated throughout all the confederations. I think you pointed out there hasn't been a pluralist, i.e. having more than one candidate standing for the presidency of any of the confederations since 2017.
Which is crazy. When you think that it's incredible. The elections are 4 years, and sometimes they come a bit early. But if, for example, as happened in CONMEBOL, I think the incumbent has been found to have done things he shouldn't have done. I said he because there are no women. This is a world without women. They don't exist. They exist a bit on the FIFA Council, but when it comes to the big guys, it's the big guys. Damn it. And yes, it's the same in for example, there could have been a pluralist election in Africa when Ahmed Ahmad was basically deposed by FIFA, which used its ethics committee to kick him out. I'm not saying, by the way, that kicking him out was the wrong thing to do, because I plead guilty. Part of what FIFA ethics committee kicking him out for was actually an investigation that I did with Paul Udoyord and Chris Edwards for the BBC and for Yosimar. And we actually put out a lot of stuff that was extremely bad for Ahmad Ahmad. But normally you should have had a pluralist election. And in fact, there were some very strong candidates who actually made themselves known for the succession of Ahmad Ahmad. But that wouldn't go for Gianni. So what he did is that he organized a meeting in Rabat, in a hotel I visited since then. I was very moved to be in that historic place, where all the candidates were put in a room. And at the beginning, in the presence of FIFA officials, which is totally against any kind of protocol or statutes, they left after there were protestations. But basically the idea was, okay, guys, you're all here together. And this is Gianni basically through his minions saying, this is my candidate, Patrice Motsepe. this is the guy we're going to go for, and you can have this, and you can have this, and you can have that. But for the sake of African football unity, we need one candidate and one candidate only. So FIFA literally dictated the fact that there would be no contested election in Africa. And the three other candidates moved out, were given compensation, political compensation. And Motsepe was installed. He was elected by applause at the next CAF Congress, and it's been the same. Sheikh Salman is Montigliani is still in place, the Canadian in CONCACAF. Dominguez is in place at CONMEBOL. We can carry on like that. All of them are still in place. And without having been elected, they're kind of mini-me versions of Infantino in a way in their own confederations. But they all defer to the big guy, the capo di capi, Mr. Infantino. That's why I use the Sopranos simile, because for me it was the most obvious one to use.
So is the moral of this story as an investigative journalist on football, be careful what you expose, because what comes next as a result of your exposure
could be actually worse. Yes, but we have to do our job. And to be honest, we shouldn't forget either that Ahmad had been put in position by Gianni Infantino as well, because Infantino wanted to oust Issa Hayatou, who was a very powerful president, confederation president, who was not without his faults, to say the least. But one thing that Hayatou was very strong on was the independence of his confederation and the way that they would never, ever give an inch to FIFA. Ever. They would work with FIFA, but if CAF decided to do something, or if CAF didn't like something FIFA were doing, CAF would actually fight against it. And Hayatou is now gone, and now we've got a man, Mr. Motsepe. I'm told by people within CAF, no, he's not a puppet, he's not Jenny's puppet, he's got a mandate of his own, blah, blah, all these sort of things. But when I see that in the facts, he basically, everything he does is exactly what is good for Gianni. Not himself, of course, but is good for Gianni. So yes, no contested elections, an autocracy. So the only way it's going to change is if the change comes from the outside. The same way that it came in 2015, because there are still loads of practices and skeletons in cupboards in Zurich, which, if they were investigated properly, maybe could bring a change, or would force FIFA to actually look to properly reform itself. But it's now gone to the extent, I know we've talked for a long time already, but I want to take this example of how big FIFA thinks it is and how big it actually is. FIFA has now contested decisions taken by the Supreme Courts of two different countries. The Supreme Court. And an amazing thing, they managed to reverse a Supreme Court decision in Trinidad and Tobago, which I was very much involved in that case, because it's like a classic case of what is wrong, by claiming that FIFA statutes gave them total control over the way the member associations were run, and that there could not be any government interference, and that therefore the adjudications made by the Supreme Court of a country did not really have any value, because they constituted government interference. And the same has gone on in Kenya. Now, this is insane. Can you think of anything, any entity, anybody who can go to a government and say, you've put this guy in jail because he was doing this and that. Well, you shouldn't have done that because he's the president of the federation. And by doing that, you're interfering with football affairs. And as FIFA statutes clearly state, you cannot interfere with football affairs. So it's our job. So you cannot do this. Can you imagine that? Well, that's what's happened. It's insane.
I think with all of this, we can talk about the detail, and the detail is fascinating, and I think tells us a lot about where football is at present. But with all of this, the fundamental proof will come down to where football is in the coming years. Because I think we forget, and I hope Gianni Infantino doesn't forget, that the role of presidency of FIFA is actually supposed to be for the good of the game. And he's supposed to be taking decisions which make the sport more popular, more enjoyable. And
safer. Absolutely.
Yes, safer for its participants. And we will see whether this array of organisational changes to the playing of football at the top level, the way professional footballers and coaches have to perform, is actually good for football as a sport in the coming years, or whether these changes he's making, and your argument is the changes are being made to cement his position of power, are actually to the detriment of the sport. That will be the ultimate test of Infantino.
And Duncan, I would add one thing, because there is one, and because you actually refer indirectly to it. If there is to be a counterpower to Gianni Infantino and Gianni Infantino's FIFA, it will have to be the players and the coaches and the fans.
Yes.
But the most important, perhaps because it is an entity which has got legal representation, which is powerful in itself, is obviously the players' syndicate, the players' union. They've made a lot of noise for a very long time about the fact that too much was asked of players, that players were getting injured. Men and women, by the way, were getting injured because of the unbelievable burden that is put on their shoulders and on their bodies in a game that is ever faster, ever more physical, demanding even more high-intensity sprints and so forth. So we have got record number of injuries, and people also who have mental health problems, which is not often mentioned, but is absolutely true, or not being given the time to recuperate. You were talking about the fact that the next Club World Cup being played when it is played will prevent the players from having their mandatory 4 weeks rest. And the thing is that FIFPro, the players syndicate, has made noises in the past. They're furious, saying that they're never consulted, they are not considered to be proper stakeholders, their opinion doesn't matter, FIFA does what FIFA wants, and they've said if they carry on like that, it is totally untenable, we're going to have to think about a strike. Now, I would call their bluff. So I would say, dear FIFPro, if you're actually serious about protecting your players, protecting the health of your players, just do it. Just tell your players, you know what, this Club World Cup, don't take part in it. We'll just boycott it. And it would be interesting, wouldn't it?
Yes, the FIFPro, we should say, are currently attempting to bring a legal action in tandem with a number of leagues across football against the changes to the international match calendar, specifically opposed to the FIFA Club World Cup. And they're trying to get that action taken at the European Court of Justice, referred to the European Court of Justice. We have to finish with the FIFA section now. I'll do a quick bit of transfer news, and that's something we talked about in an earlier podcast, Newcastle United's interest in England under-21 goalkeeper James Trafford. They are continuing to pursue that interest, despite weeks of discussions, have yet to meet Burnley's asking price for the goalkeeper they signed from Manchester City a year ago. It's an interesting pursuit from Newcastle because they currently have 5 senior goalkeepers on their books, following the signings of 37-year-old John Ruddy on a 1-year contract and their unexpected PSR trade with Nottingham Forest for Greece international goalkeeper Odysseus Vlachodimos. Let's finish the pod, Philippe, with a reference to the European Championship, which goes to its final on Sunday. England in the final of an international tournament for the first time in their history when it's played outside their own country. I will choose my villain of the week from the Euros, and it's going to a governing body, appropriately enough. UEFA, for appointing Anthony Taylor to the Spain-Germany semi-final, where he managed to allow Toni Kroos to take one of the most talented players in the tournament, Pedri, out of the competition inside 10 minutes with his typically generous, lenient English refereeing, which came as no surprise to a lot of people. And then appointing the German Felix Zweier, a referee punished for match fixing and publicly accused of match fixing by England star player Jude Bellingham, to the England semi-final against the Netherlands, where Zweier, after a week of protestations from the English media, how could this happen, decided to award a penalty to England at a key moment of the match after a video review of an incident in which Harry Kane kicked through into Dutch defender which also was preceded by a double handball by Bukayo Saka. So well done, UEFA, for getting the officiating right on these key games at the tail end of the tournament. Philippe, I will let you do the hero of the week. The joyful.
Okay, I will choose my hero of the week would be Kylian Mbappe. Certainly not for what he contributed on the field, because that was pretty dire, to be absolutely honest, as he has admitted, but Kylian Mbappe and those of his teammates who had the courage to speak out against the dangers faced by their country in the general election. I do think it took a lot of courage to speak out as they did and to speak as eloquently as they did. Mbappe's, I was going to say speech, but without notes, was so eloquent, so clear, so passionate, and yet so reasonable. Just confirmed everything that people have thought about him for a while, which is one of these days, this guy will end up Prime Minister or President of the Republic. But they spoke out, and they spoke out very well. I have to say that Didier Deschamps behaved very well as well. He didn't speak out against the dangers of the far right, but he explained that his players were first and foremost citizens, which I think is a very important thing to say. And so to do this with dignity and at the same time go through to a semi-final, which, to be honest, I still have regrets about. I think they really had it within themselves to get back into that game, but there you go. Kylian completely missed his Euro from a playing point of view, but off the field he played a blinder. So thanks to him.
Yes, I've very much enjoyed your article on this subject for the Guardian this week. Philippe, thank you for joining us on the Transfers podcast. It's been an education, as always. And vive la révolution.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you very much for having me, Duncan. And have a good one. Have a good final.
You've been listening to the Transfers podcast, powered by FootballTransfers.com. If you liked what you heard, please follow us on your favourite podcast platform and turn on automatic downloads to get the latest episode as soon as it's released. If you really, really like the Transfers podcast, lend us just a wee bit more of your time by rating or reviewing the pod. Your support helps us build a bigger audience and bring you more news, analysis and insight. You can also follow and message us on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube at Transfers Podcast. And you can follow us on Twitter at TransfersCast. Philippe is on Twitter at Philippe Auclair. I'm at Duncan Castles. We now have a WhatsApp channel. Search for the Transfers Podcast on WhatsApp or follow the links on the show notes. Our music and production is by Mark Caulfield at Pro Podcast Production. And we'll be back next week. Stay safe, be well, and thank you as always for listening.